Hello, Troy here with SFP Nostalgia Motorsports, and welcome to the Exhaust Stroke, a show where I take a break from my projects in the shop to bring to you anything and everything Nostalgia Motorsports, from the awesome cars to the cool parts to the great people that are still driving their cars on the street and racing them on the strip, keeping this awesome hobby alive. Today we're obviously talking about carburetors, and for good reason. When you purchase your old classic car that you want to make a performance screamer out of, one of the very first modifications you'll likely do is to get rid of this 2-barrel and install a 4-barrel. It's awesome bang for your buck. It was the first modification, actually the second modification I did to my Chevelle. The first modification I did was put a torque converter in it. But this carburetor here is a 2-barrel carburetor off of my Chevelle, and I originally replaced it when it was a 307 with this guy here. This is a carburetor that I used in high school on the Chevelle. Worked awesome. It's a 600 CFM Holley vacuum secondary. Why did I use a 600 Holley vacuum secondary? Because it was given to me. It was a carburetor that a friend of mine had that just could not get it working, and he said it was garbage and he was going to throw it away, and I said I'll take it. After a rebuild and some good cleaning, it worked like a charm for years. So that is a 600 vacuum secondary. One of the things that you'll hear at the local cruise-in, the drag strip, or a car show, you'll hear terms being thrown around concerning Holley carburetors. You'll hear dual feed, you'll hear single feed, you'll hear double pumper, you'll hear mechanical secondary, and vacuum secondary. What do all of those mean? Well, here we have a Holley vacuum secondary, but it's a dual feed. 2 fuel inlets, so that's when you will see a dual feed fuel line on these carburetors like I have here. So that's a dual feed. This here is a single feed vacuum secondary carburetor. So does that make this a double pumper? Absolutely not. And that is one of the common misconceptions that I still hear at the drag strip today when I'm in the pits and people are either looking at my engine or somebody else. They'll say, wow, look at that Holley double pumper. That is not a double pumper. If it's a vacuum secondary, it has one accelerator pump, and that's what it's referring to. The term double pumper comes from this. You have your primary accelerator pump and a secondary accelerator pump. 1, 2, double pumper. This is a dual feed mechanical secondary, so it's a double pumper. If it's a mechanical secondary Holley, it has 2 accelerator pumps, making it the double pumper. If it has a vacuum secondary, which you can always tell a vacuum secondary because of the vacuum diaphragm housing right here. That's what's actually opening up the secondaries on the Holley. You flip it upside down, you have 1 accelerator pump. Now, they use a standardized casting essentially for the primary and secondary. So here's where that other accelerator pump would be if this would be a mechanical secondary, but there's nothing there. So it is a single accelerator pump, not a double pumper. So hopefully that clears up some of the misconceptions with the Holley. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Holley vacuum secondary is considered a controlled secondary carburetor due to the fact that it actually is utilizing a vacuum diaphragm to open up the secondary butterflies. Now what if I tell you that the Rochester 4-jet, the Rochester Quadra-jet, as well as the Edelbrock or Carter AFB carburetors are also considered controlled secondary carburetors. However, all of them utilize mechanical secondaries, where the linkage is actually opening up the butterflies in the base plate. How is that considered a controlled secondary carburetor? Well, there's no vacuum diaphragm on these. They actually utilize an air valve. Let me explain. So here are 3 examples of air valve secondary carburetors, which are classified as controlled secondary carburetors. Each of these carburetors utilizes mechanical linkage to actually open up the butterfly. But to actually increase the CFM of the carburetor and allow air and fuel to flow through the secondaries, the air valve needs to open first. Each of these does accomplish it slightly differently, but the concept is the same. Let's start with the Rochester Quadrajet. Here we have the Rochester Quadrajet 4-barrel carburetor. A carburetor used on a wide array of vehicles by General Motors and some other manufacturers, ranging from luxury cars to the hottest performance cars of the era. How was this carburetor so versatile? Part of it is due to the spread bore design, meaning smaller primaries, larger secondaries. But the Quadrajet takes that to the extreme. You can see how small these primaries are compared to the secondaries. Not only did this allow for good gas mileage and drivability, but it also allowed for a pretty significant CFM potential. These were large carburetors with a good CFM rating for performance applications. Also, the Venturi design, when you look down in the bore, that hourglass shape, that's the Venturi area. That is a very, very efficient design on this carburetor. Now, as far as the air valve secondary, this is the only one here out of my examples where the air valve is directly on top of the carburetor. So when the engine demands the secondaries, you operate your throttle to full throttle, but air will not flow through the secondaries until this air valve. First of all, why is the secondary air valve even necessary? Well, without it, you would have a drastic bog because you're not getting any fuel or enough fuel being introduced into the secondary bores to prevent this bog from happening. That's why a Holley double pumper is unique, that it has a secondary accelerator pump. That is preventing the bog. You can tune it out by adding more fuel or less fuel depending on how those secondaries are opening with the Holley double pumper. With these carburetors, with a direct link to your secondaries from the primaries utilizing linkage, those secondaries would drop open. The fuel would just not be there to support it. So that's why you have to have some type of an air valve to allow for a gradual opening. As that fuel is starting to be introduced, the airflow can increase with it as well. Now here we have the Rochester 4Jet, a 4-barrel that was used on performance cars prior to the Rochester Quadrajet. This uses the air valve secondary design, but it's not located on the top. It's located well within the barrels of the secondary side of this carburetor. This carburetor does not offer the CFM potential as the Quadrajet, but it was still widely used on many performance vehicles. My Buick Skylark used it, 327s, 283s, and up through the mid-60s used it, and you will even see some stock Eliminator cars still running these things and getting the job done. Let's take the top off to get a deeper look at how this air valve secondary works. You have to be very careful with these because of how the floats are hung. Now these boosters are held in only with 3 screws, so they come out very easily. So here we can get a better look at the secondary air valve of the Rochester 4Jet. It's spring-loaded, so you can see how it returns. So as the airflow demands are there, this will be wide open. Here we have the final example of air valve secondary that I'll be showing you today. This is an Edelbrock carburetor. It's the same design though as a Carter AFB, and it does have the air valve located below the booster level, just like the Rochester 4Jet did. Let's take off the top of this carburetor so that we can access the air valve. This is another one where you have to be very careful pulling off the top of the carburetors because you're dealing with the float bowls hanging from the top and your metering rods. Here we see the secondary air valve of the Edelbrock carburetor, very similar or the same as a Carter AFB, and it's located below the secondary booster. What's also unique here is the fact that it does not use a spring to return it to the closed position, but it uses a counterweight to bring it back to the closed position. Remember why this is here. This is here so that the fuel being provided can be supplied at a rate that will prevent the bog from happening. Your secondaries are opening mechanically, and if they'd flop wide open, the fuel rate of flow here is not great enough to support the airflow demand. So you have a drastic lean condition. So the object here is that as the fuel is being pulled in, this valve here is creating more sensitivity within the venturi, within these secondary barrels here, so that it pulls more fuel in, and the fuel is meeting the demand of the airflow until you get totally wide open, and that you're maximizing your fuel being introduced into the secondary bores, and it can actually accept it and prevent that lean condition. That's why they're here. Carburetors are just, to me, they're just awesome. There's so much engineering going on here with Bernoulli's principle and things of that nature. I just totally geek out over them compared to fuel injection. Let's come back to the Holley vacuum secondary carburetor to get a better understanding how it works. This is not a mechanical secondary carburetor. You can operate the primary to full throttle, and the secondary throttle shaft does not even rotate. So this is not a mechanical secondary carburetor. Yet, it has some means of a controlled secondary. Remember, if you go back to the carburetors we just looked at, those were mechanical secondaries. The linkage is actually operating the secondary butterflies, but still it's a controlled secondary carburetor by means of the air valve. This here utilizes a vacuum secondary housing that houses a diaphragm. That diaphragm is actually opening and closing the secondary. Let me show you in more detail how that actually functions. Here is the vacuum diaphragm housing, and right here is the port location where the vacuum is being sensed. This is where the vacuum signal is coming from. And with vacuum being sensed at this location, it's actually allowing this diaphragm to operate, and you have to overcome the spring pressure in order for this vacuum diaphragm to be pulled upward and actually open the secondaries. Let me try to show you how this works. I will be the vacuum pump in this case. Place a hose against here. Let's see if I can make this work. There you can see how it functions. All right, now let's open this up and see what's exactly inside. Now with the 4 screws removed, we can remove the lid, exposing the spring, which is attached to the lid, but it is removable. This spring here is actually going to determine how quickly your secondaries will respond, and that would be due to the spring rate. So Holley makes a wide variety of springs with different spring rates. So the vacuum signal is coming in here. So you're pulling vacuum here, and there's also a small check valve ball in there. The vacuum then enters the lid of the cover through this port here, and you can see how it would travel in that little slot there. So this whole area then is subjected to vacuum, and the diaphragm is pulled up, and you can see how the rate of how it gets pulled up dictated by the spring pressure being applied to the diaphragm. So here's the location where the secondary diaphragm housing would be, and right here is the vacuum port location where the signal, the vacuum signal, is actually coming from. We're supplying the vacuum source for the secondary diaphragm. But where is that coming from? It's actually coming from the primary venturi closest to that housing, closest to the vacuum housing. So let's flip this carburetor over here. So I understand it's probably hard to see, but right there is a tiny hole in the primary venturi closest to the vacuum diaphragm housing. It's on that side of the carburetor. So that little hole there is where the vacuum signal's coming from that will actually begin to operate or begin to pull that vacuum diaphragm up closer to the housing lid, which then in turn opens up your secondaries. Now for demonstration purposes, I have taped a piece of string into this carburetor barrel, and you can see right here at the venturi is where that small orifice is, that small hole that goes directly to where the intersection is of the main body of the carburetor and the vacuum diaphragm housing. So instead of vacuum, I will blow air through from the main body side where the vacuum diaphragm housing attaches, and this string should move within this particular area of the carburetor so that you can see that they're directly related, and that's where you're actually getting your vacuum signal from. So this hopefully demonstrates how a vacuum secondary Holley actually functions. The vacuum signal is actually coming from one of the primary venturies. As engine RPM increases, so does velocity through the venturi on the primary side, increasing the vacuum and allowing that vacuum diaphragm to continue to be pulled up and eventually overcome that spring pressure, and the secondaries open. Very simple, but very different in the method when compared to the Rochester 4-jet, the Quadrajet, and also the Carter or Edelbrock carburetors using a secondary air valve. So that might bring you to the question, which carburetor is the best for me? I can't really answer that. It depends on your application, it depends on your circumstances. If it was me and I just bought my first project, let's say it already had a 4-barrel on it. If it already has a Rochester Quadrajet, I'd use it and I'd try my best to tune it to see how fast I can get that car to go before ever changing anything else. Now in the case of my Chevelle, I didn't have a 4-barrel. I took off my 2-barrel and I got this carburetor right here, as I mentioned, from a friend for free. And then I rebuilt it and tuned it to the best of my ability, and I learned from it. I also went to, right from this Holley, I built my 350 and went straight to an Edelbrock 750. Why didn't I go to a Holley 750? Because that Edelbrock was owned by my brother-in-law and he gave it to me. So it was another free carburetor. So I learned how to tune the Edelbrock, and I ran some of the quickest ETs ever with the Chevelle on that carburetor. Now the carburetor that's on the Chevelle is a double pumper Holley 750 that I've modified. I have not hit the track yet with that carburetor, but it's going to be kind of interesting to see how it runs. So what is the best carburetor for your application? Is it a Holley? Is it an Edelbrock? Is it a Quadrajet? Is it a Rochester 4G? It depends on your needs, your pocketbook, and what's available. I will tell you this much. I would like to debunk the theory of one carburetor versus another and performance. If you understand the method of tuning a carburetor, the fundamentals, I promise you, you can make any carburetor perform good on your vehicle. All of them have their idiosyncrasies, but once you get past that, you can tune all of them to perform very similar. I promise you that. And I'm going to take the Chevelle to the track with the double pumper 750 that's on it. We're going to run that, get that dialed in. Then I'm also going to put on a 750 vacuum secondary Holley. We're going to tune it similar. and we're going to see what the ET is with the vacuum secondary, and then we're going to put on my old Edelbrock and see what we can get out of that. So you'll have to stay tuned and catch that on a future episode of the Exhaust Stroke. Thank you everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, hit the like and subscribe button, and I promise there'll be more coming your way. Thank you everyone for watching. Take care.